So Games Workshop have released their official table of Warhammer 40K win rates and also given us a few more handy hints as to what's coming for the next balance update. Let's talk through the Metawatch update and what it means for the game. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where in this video I thought we'd do a quick reaction to Games Workshop's latest Metawatch, rather an interesting one with a whole bunch of numbers as to how well 40k armies are doing, and quite a few more interesting details besides. The last 40k Metawatch that they made was the one that came out at the same time as the balanced data slate, and it's perhaps not too surprising to see them leave a reasonable gap between that update and making some new content, allowing enough time for a little bit of data to build up rather than just trying to jump in a couple of weeks later with some very early takes. And broadly speaking, their article was broken down into a discussion video, a table of Warhammer 40k win rates, and a couple of showcase army lists for the Games Workshop's own Tampa Open tournament in the USA. That was the one that was won by the Fun Sisters of Battle list that I talked about on the channel on Monday. Really cool to see the Adeptus Auroratus on top, as they're kind of a mid-ranking faction in 40k at the moment. With their discussion video, they usually just go over a few main themes of balancing 40k and what's going well and badly, and a few themes that they try and focus on when they're deciding what will change next time round. Broadly speaking, they were really quite pleased with themselves for the success of the balanced data slate to get 10th edition 40k into a much better shape than it was before. And even if these balance passes don't always get everything right, I would fully agree with them that they did go pretty hard with the last balance pass, but generally made a whole load of positive changes to the game. 40k does seem to be in a lot more of a position where the majority of armies compete somewhat with the majority of the other armies, and while there's still a few outliers, it is hard to overstate exactly how out of balance 40k was at the start of the edition. Armies like Eldari and Genestealer Cult with win rates approaching 70, when some like Death Guard and Leagues of Votan were down to 30. Unfortunately, it seems that we're now at least considerably better than that. I do think it's important to give a little bit of credit where it's due. There've definitely been a fair few balance updates in the past where they've been so light touch with the changes they probably shouldn't have even bothered, or have made far more changes that have hurt factions more than they've helped them, or even given weird improvements to the top factions of the game. Otherwise, for most of the video, they broadly talked through what had gone up and down, a few bits about the Tampa Open tournament lists, and also had a few interesting things to say about detachments as well, basically going with the idea that every detachment is aimed to be at least viable in-game, though acknowledging when the codexes come out, realistically probably not every single detachment is going to be top-tier competitive or anything like that. I would say that probably out of the first two codexes so far they haven't done too bad a job. I feel like at least the majority of detachments in Codex Space Marines and Codex Tyranids are interesting, but there are a few that just seem clearly underpowered, like the Tyranid Crusher Stampede or the Space Marines First Company. I think it seems kind of unlikely that they'd do focus balance updates for individual detachments to try and make them balanced against each other. In 9th edition and before, they often didn't really make much effort to balance sub-factions within an army. That just wasn't usually something that they bothered with. Otherwise, and perhaps always some of the most interesting things that they talk about with these Metawatch updates, are a few hints as to what we might expect out of the next balance update. We already knew that the January update would be the next one. Previously they billed it as the September one would be a points only one, but that kind of went out the window when they realised just how much they needed to try and get things back in balance in 40k. So it's probably for the best that they went for a full balanced data slate one there. It seems kind of likely that given the January one was already supposed to be a balanced data slate type update, they'd probably still go for that for this. It definitely does feel that there's rules in 40k that are often better fixed by some rules changes than points changes, and perhaps in particular for reversing any nerfs they feel armies that they've hit a bit too hard. That could be one way. For example, they could help out Custodians and Knights that seem to be towards the lower end of the meta right now, and actually remove rules bloat into the bargain, which would be kind of nice. Otherwise, they mentioned their design philosophy is usually that they want things to be good enough to want to include, but not auto-include in every single army list, unless things are just an iconic unit that's always going to be the centre of the faction. More niche support choices are generally going to get hurt by the balance pass if they just happen to be in every single top army. Sort of close to that as well, they also mentioned about Eldari Night Spinners in particular, referencing their heavy use in one of the top lists at the Tampa Open, and I feel like with Eldari sticking their win rate above the Games Workshop 55% target, they're in line for some more nerfs. I feel like Night Spinners are probably going to have the crosshairs on them, given that they're really quite often played in competitive lists right now, and are just generally considered one of the Eldari units they went surprisingly lightly on, when they did give them the broad battery of points increases that they had last time. Otherwise, for specific things that were called out for potential hints towards updates, Drukhari are lower than the 45% win percentage, by their own methods that would call them out for boosts at the next data slate, and Eldari and apparently Orcs are above the 55%, at least by their measures, so they do seem to be some of the armies that are most likely to attract points changes as a result. They also really quite specifically mentioned Adeptus Custodes and Imperial Knights as armies that they feel that they went a bit hard on with the balance changes. Both of those were perhaps problematic factions previously in the game with very high win rates, that now they're numbered as two of the lower performing factions in Warhammer 40k, and they're likely to see at least some small changes as a result. Otherwise, and perhaps some of the biggest and most interesting info that came out of the update, was Games Workshop's win rate table. This is one that they apparently take data from both small and big tournaments, and basically scrape a whole load of data from the various apps that log those events. It's kind of interesting comparing and contrasting this to the various datasets that tend to be a bit more competitively minded. There's a fair few out there that just track big 5-round and big player tournaments, and it does mean that you get some differences in the data from the one to the other. Games Workshop's win rates often seem to be a bit closer to 50% in general. I suppose it might be reflective of a slightly more casual meta, where in the real world most people aren't playing with hyper-optimized 40k armies all the time, and perhaps for the average players or more casual game type level, I do feel like player skill generally has more of an impact than whether you're playing the top army or not, though obviously both things go into winning or losing a game. As well as that, in the data, armies that tend to get by on raw power and sheer damage or defense alone tend to do a bit better in these sort of data sets. Things like Imperial and Chaos Knights with just their big stat check stat lines, Adeptus Custodes with their big beatdown golden armor and massive melee, and I suspect armies like Orcs with just a whole load of greenskins rushing you with a whole load of violence. I suspect that most of those might be a few percentage points higher than they might have been otherwise if you looked at data that was only looking at the absolute top end of play. Going through the table chunk by chunk though, and this is the lower end of the table, Drukhari coming in last with apparently a win rate of 44%, seemingly the faction with the most issues in Warhammer 40k at the moment, and generally tending to get by at the moment by spamming loads of high power anti-tank dart lancers, a lot of the rest of their index just being kind of underwhelming besides that. The 44% number does seem to be a bit higher than I would have guessed. Independent datasets usually seem to have them around about 40% these days. But either way, really quite decidedly one of the lowest performing factions in the game, and seem pretty much guaranteed to get some good help next time round. Otherwise, for other lower performers, they've got Blood Angels, Adeptus Custodes, Grey Knights, Astra Militarum, Imperial Knights, and the Space Marines, none of which are really all that surprising, I think. As per the win rate video that I did earlier in the week, that seems to be in pretty perfect alignment there, though I did have basically all of these with slightly lower win percentages otherwise. My guess would be that even if they're within the theoretical 45 to 55% target of them, I'd guess they'd still probably receive some buffs when the next balance pass comes around. Obviously Space Marines, the numbers are going to be a bit meaningless here, seeing as they've just had a whole codex come out. It'll be interesting to see where they wind up after that, with a much worse Oath of Moment, but a lot more detachment options and some slightly cheaper units to play with. Otherwise, for the middle of the table, for armies between 48 and 50%, we've got the Necrons, Tyranids, Dark Angels, Genestealer Cults, Adeptus Auroritus, Space Wolves, Death Guard, and Adeptus Mechanicus. For the raw numbers here, I'm perhaps most surprised to see the Adeptus Mechanicus, Death Guard, and Space Wolves quite this high. Again, those ones are all around about an extra 2 or 3% higher than I've seen in other places, but most of the rest do seem really quite consistent with other scores. It definitely doesn't mean that armies here aren't in need of rebalancing of one sort or another though. I feel like in particular the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Sisters of Battle perhaps aren't in a very good feels-good place to play. It's kind of a bit sad to see a Sisters of Battle unique melee units not doing anywhere near as well, besides Arco-Flagellants I suppose, and Admech remaining a very very infrequently played army at tournaments at the moment, and the armies that do tend to turn up tend to be very very heavy on the Cataphrone Breacher spam. I guess Admech are getting a codex release that I'd guess is probably going to be coming before the January balance pass, so it seems that one's most likely going to be the next opportunity they have to rebalance things should they wish to. I really hope that the Admech Codex was written at least in part after 10th edition came out though. They really feel like a faction that could do with some fundamental datasheet rewrites, and maybe just a bit more raw power on a per model basis, as at the moment they have to have their units charged ridiculously cheap to even be worth considering. Finally, we get to the top of the table, and as with agreement with just about everywhere else, it does seem that Games Workshop are recognising that Eldari are the single strongest faction in 40k. It was kind of immediately obvious that they didn't really hit them quite hard enough in the last balance update. Even if they did move a massive amount closer to the middle than they were before, they were up at more like 67 or 68% wins, which was kind of ludicrous. And having the top faction in the game only at 57% is just crazily better than it was before. Probably means that they're still in line for some nerfs, though if they do go in with points again, I guess they could afford to be a little bit more circumscribed than last time, and just pick out a few units that really do seem to be getting spammed at tournaments quite a bit, and hopefully use that to create a bit more internal balance in the codex in general. Otherwise, by Games Workshop's numbers, they seem to have Orcs in second by a clear 2%, which is kind of surprising. Other numbers that I've been seeing elsewhere has them more on level with the next few down the list, Votann, Chaos Marines, Tau and Black Templars, but certainly not 2 points ahead of them. They're undoubtedly one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k though, their army list often building around lots of violent boys jumping out of trucks, plus some squig hog melee, storm boys and grots to do objective things, and going quite character heavy with some fighty bosses, maybe on squigosaurs. I feel like even if they do nose back down to just within the 55% thing, they're probably going to get some points changes again. Maybe might not be the worst overall, for some small nerfs to their strongest melee damage dealers might help create just a little bit more internal balance within the index, particularly if paired maybe with some points cuts or rules boosts to buggies and things. At the moment they really feel like an army with just one big style of play pretty much. Anything building around Dakka fire support or dread mobs and things just tends not to do very well. Otherwise, as I talked about in the last big win rate video earlier in the week, it really does seem to be Eldari and Chaos Space Marines specifically that seem to be vastly overrepresented in big tournament wins. The Chaos Marines might only have a 54% win chance, but they tend to be massively overrepresented at the top level of play, and even more so than Orcs, Votann, Tau Empire and Templars, though all of those are definitely doing well as well. I'd be kind of surprised if we don't get at least some light touch points changes to the majority of things towards the top of the game to try and push them a bit more towards the middle. Otherwise, and also doing a little bit better than average, we've got the Chaos Knights, seemingly solidly better than their Imperial cousins after the points changes. Carnivores and Rampagers are a lot more playable now. Deathwatch are still doing fine, though aren't played very much in tournaments. They are the single least played army in Warhammer 40k right now, so data for them will be a bit more limited than most. Thousand Sons still seems to be holding steady despite the nerfs that they took, as do Chaos Demons, and World Eaters have absolutely shot up compared with where they were before the data slate. A broad battery of simple points decreases seems to have done rather well for them, and I feel like they're in a fairly balanced spot right now. In any case, fairly interesting stuff. Let me know what you make of their table and their hints towards balance updates. Obviously still definitely some room for improvement for 40k balance at the moment, as is always the case, but it has been kind of positive to see them get army win rates under control from the disaster that they were at the start of 10th edition. I feel like in previous ones like 9th and 8th edition it took them far longer than this. In any case, let me know your thoughts, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to keep up with 40k news and Games Workshop's game updates. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.